So I recently found out that borderline personality disorder is often a misdiagnosis, or people are often given a misdiagnosis of borderline personality disorder when they actually better fit the criteria for high masking autism. So I am recently got an evaluation because I had previously 20 years ago gotten the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and I have since not qualified for it. Like I'm in recovery according to um like my 10-year ago psychiatric evaluation. But when I found out about this thing, that it could be a misdiagnosis for someone who actually has autism, I followed up and got another evaluation with that in mind, with someone who kind of specializes in high masking autism. And sure enough, I much more accurately fit the diagnostic criteria for this sort of female phenotype or high masking autism than I do for borderline. And it was really interesting to me. So I wanted to share it with you all. So I'm going to go through point by point the differentiating characteristics, and how they sort of show up in my life. So, one of the first ones is that autism is neurodevelopmental. So, you are born with autism, you do not acquire it, versus borderline is considered to be a response to trauma or abandonment or neglect in childhood. Or unstable attachments. So, if you have someone who does not have a history of, early trauma or neglect, then perhaps that can point you in the direction of autism. For me, I do have early trauma. I had some head injuries as a baby. And so that is one that is not a clear like this or that. I could fall in both categories with that history. With borderline, another characteristic is emotional dysregulation is interpersonal, involving feelings of abandonment, rejection, or conflict. And in autism, emotional dysregulation comes from sensory overload or confusion in social settings or difficulty processing emotions. And it's typically like unintentional. So I would say the emotional dysregulation that is experienced for people who have more borderline characteristics is definitely also unintentional. It's a different kind of overwhelm, but it makes sense to me that like the dysregulation is more for someone who fits the borderline characteristics. Around the idea that like I'm really upset because you might leave me. I'm really upset because we're having relationship conflict, and that scares me because I have early history of um unstable attachment or of feeling abandoned in my primary relationships. Whereas with autism, there may not be that correlation of feeling abandoned or worrying about the relationship ending, but it's just like sincerely like, what's going on? I'm so confused, or I'm so overwhelmed, which is totally the only conflict I have with my 13-year-old is when I'm overstimulated or overwhelmed and I'm like, I can't. So like an example is we went to the Nutcracker yesterday and it was like very loud and very crowded and a ton of people, and we were trying to find each other, and it was long, and it was like I had some like sense of justice type things that were upsetting me, and there was just like a lot of feelings. And it was after a long day of sledding, so I was already pretty overtaxed. And then I was trying to make a communication connection with my kid without the person we were with realizing what was happening, but he didn't get it. And so I was like, I am trying, and I got like annoyed and like frustrated, and he was like, I didn't understand what you're doing, and I was like, I know, but I'm so frustrated because I'm so overstimulated. So that is a really good example of that. Okay. So then another characteristic of borderline is fear of abandonment, and intense emotions lead to unstable relationships characterized by the cycle of idealization and devaluation. So like I'm obsessed with you and then I like hate you. Um and then for autism, the social difficulty is around understanding the social cues and unwritten rules and navigating relationships. And For autism, there's a preference for the deep, consistent connections, not just like a lot of sort of surfacey level or small talky type interactions. So the difference there, I think, is really notable, um, especially for those of us who identify as like deep introverts who don't really need a lot of friends around. So like I wouldn't so much like it's okay with me to end a relationship, which I previously was worried was like this devaluation cycle, but it was like, this is really hard and it's okay with me if we don't keep going because I don't understand what's happening. And that has to do with the like, I don't understand what's happening right now. Like, are we having a conflict? Are we okay? I remember in childhood, I would be like, are we fine? Like, is like, because kids have a lot of drama, and I was always confused. Whereas the it's not so much a confusion with the borderline experience of that. It's more like, please don't leave me, don't end the relationship, I need to keep this relationship, or get away from me, I never want to see you again, versus like there's not a confusion there. I feel like the words that help me understand autism more than anything, or my experience of autism, is confusion. Like just sincerely confused and overwhelmed are my two main words. Okay, the next one is fluctuating a sense of self with frequent shifts in values, goals, identity based on external factors and relationships. That's for borderline. So there's this like I'm like, whatever you are, I'm going to become it so that we can at least maintain the relationship and you won't leave me. And the autism sort of counterpoint of this is like, I will try to fit in by masking. I'll try to like make myself more acceptable to you, even though I'm aware that it doesn't feel sincere and it feels extremely exhausting and I don't want to do it. Versus the person experiencing these borderline characteristics might be like, no, I really truly do want to be into ballet because you're into ballet. Versus someone with autism might be like, oh yeah, ballet is great. And then in their head, they're like, I can't believe I have to talk about this right now. Like I'm trying so hard to make this a fine interaction, but I'm exhausted. Okay. Emotional, so this is a borderline characteristic. Emotional reactivity and fear of rejection causes social difficulties, which leads to intense or manipulative communication. So this is like, I'm so desperate to not lose this relationship that I might like lie or kind of change the truth out of like a desperation to not be rejected. And I might become like very emotional, even like threaten to harm myself or make big threats or claims because I'm trying so hard to keep that relationship. Versus with someone who has more autism characteristics, there's going to be like very literal, direct, maybe kind of formal communication that doesn't necessarily try to convince others of anything, and maybe even sounds like a little rude sometimes because it's so direct. And then like a real difficulty with nonverbal communication, abstract language, and sarcasm and humor. So getting jokes and stuff. And that's certainly huge for me. I end up in some relationship conflict often when I'm like missing the point or I'm too direct, and people are like, you're not really supposed to say that. That's kind of rude. Or I just like really miss the nonverbal cues and don't understand the sarcasm or abstract language. Like So many times my kid uses sarcasm and I take it literally. And then he's like, no, I'm using sarcasm. So I do not catch that. Okay. So with someone with borderline characteristics, it's less common to have sensory issues. But if there are, then they may be more related to like trauma or emotional distress. But with people with autism characteristics, like huge sensitivity to sensory input, light, sound, textures of food, taste of food, touch, since like textures of clothing on your body, those kind of things. And it doesn't have to be related to like emotional dysregulation or trauma. Um, and then borderline characteristic is impulsivity and self-harm that are related to like big emotional distress and trying to regulate, calm yourself down through self-harm or impulsive like risky behaviors. And that one can be kind of tricky because there is like with autism in like very overwhelming, overstimulating experiences. There can be like some head banging or scratching or biting, and that can be related to overwhelm. Um, so that one's a little tricky. But then with another characteristic of autism that's not necessarily seen with people with borderline characteristics is like rigidity around routines, special interests, or repetitive movements or song lyrics, or in your head thinking of song lyrics, or reading the same book, or watching the same TV show, or doing the same activity, are like self-soothing and calm down. Those are more likely to be the like self-regulation than like a self-harm or impulsivity, which is in someone with borderline characteristics. So this was so helpful to me. I hope it's helpful to you. When I went through this, I had there's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. There's seven main things on this list. On the borderline side, I do have several characteristics still of borderline. I have one, um, I have that I had some trauma in childhood, um, and that I had a history of self-harm. It was head hitting, so it's, could be in the category of the like overwhelm with autism. So yeah, those are the two I have on the borderline side. And then I have all of them on the autism side. Um, so I think that's why she felt that is more likely autism that fits me. But anyways, it's really wonderful to know that people are talking about this and realizing that historically borderline is like 99% people assigned female at birth. And so it could be that there's just like this whole slew of people who have been diagnosed with borderline when they have just a different presentation of autism. And, I'm actually more one that leans towards like calling people that have more borderline characteristics like a CPTSD, because I think borderline is just really stigmatized and not understood or respected. I will say that I have been taking dialectical behavioral therapy classes for close to a decade. That was created to support people with borderline characteristics, and I find it to be incredibly helpful. And I will put my DBT class below because I love it so much. But I will say that something that was interesting that I thought about after the evaluation was that Um, the DBT really reduced my borderline characteristics. There were behaviors that I had that were more from this list that I don't have anymore that I have decreased because of what I've learned in dialectical behavioral therapy. But the things on the autism list, none of them have shifted with dialectical behavioral therapy. So that kind of also indicates to me that, like, those things are the neurodevelopmental, like, they're not going to be like trained out of me because it's the way that my brain does things. And I think that we can all, become skillful, but I'm not trying to like get my autism traits gone. I just want to learn how to be a better communicator and self advocate for myself, and make better decisions about how to support myself, knowing that I have these characteristics. So, anyways, I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any thoughts or questions or things to add. I'm super interested to learn more about this. Okay, lots of love.